and welcome back to yet another episode of the Kitabi Karwan podcast. Today we have with us a very special guest, the author of The Illuminated, Anindita Ghose. Now, before I introduce the author, let me just tell you this is one of the best books I've read this year, and I would highly recommend all of you to go out and buy this book. I absolutely loved the book, the way it was written, and the kind of emotions it spoke about. I think each one of you would definitely enjoy reading this particular book. Now, coming back to Anindita. Anindita is a writer and journalist based out of Mumbai and was formerly the editor of Mint Lounge and was a features director of Vogue India. I don't want to give a lot about this book away, so let's just jump right into the interview and talk to Anindita. Hello, Anindita. Welcome to the Kitabi Karwan podcast. I'm so glad to have you here. I just finished reading The Illuminated a couple of days back, and I am in I actually have a lack of words right now. I'm speechless as to how beautifully written the book is. So congratulations, and I know it's your first book, so I'm pretty sure you must be excited with all the critical acclaim that's coming your way and all the great reviews. How are you feeling?
Firstly, thank you, Siddharth. It's great to be here on this podcast with you. I know you're a lawyer by profession, but you've been doing the book stuff pretty religiously for a while. So I'm happy to kind of be in your very curated platform. It feels good, but to be honest, it also feels a bit unreal. The book actually also officially became a bestseller, I think a week or two ago, but everything's happening virtually, right? I've also only been to two stores for signings. The two stores closest to my home is where my publisher set up. So with everything happening kind of on Zoom, this is also on Zoom. It feels a bit unreal. I believe festivals, lit fests are kind of finally opening up. I've been invited to things in Jan and Feb. Maybe when you're, speaking to a live audience or you're meeting your readers, maybe things will feel different. So, of course, I feel good, but I'm saying it feels unreal. So, I don't actually know how to answer your question. It's been kind of strange having a book out in this time when you're not getting the nutrition of kind of hearing back from readers. So, it's been a bit sad, honestly.
I mean, I kind of get it, but then it also goes back to the kind of time we've been having for the past couple of years. It's just, to use the cliched word, unprecedented times. And to be honest, I've had the exact opposite experience that you've been having. I completely empathize with your situation as an author to come out with a book right now and not being able to get that organic feedback from the audience. But as a reader, it's actually been a very rich time because a lot of authors and publishers have become way more active on social media and on the internet and have been interacting a lot more with their fans. Like these podcasts have just blossomed up. There have been a couple of more other Instagram lives kind of things happening. So I think readers have
Right,
gotten a lot more access.
they've been free to come on on the Kitabi Karma podcast, you mean to
Exactly.
so,
Yeah. Yes.
so it's
Yes.
been good for you.
It's been beautiful. In fact, I launched the podcast during the pandemic. I had some time on my hand and it worked really well for me. I got to talk to some of my favorite authors, some really amazing authors like you. So it's been absolutely wonderful. So as a reader, no one's complaining. But yeah, I completely get where you're coming from. I think I'm hoping the Lit Fest come back. I think there was one that was happening over the previous weekend. It was a Creators Fest, but it happened virtually. But I'm hoping like the on in-person events start happening again. But Anindita, before we carry on this conversation, I have a very cliched question which I ask every guest when they join the show, um, and it kind of stems from the fact that so in today's day and age, you have authors who are relatively more public, right? I mean, your persona or details about you. There are a lot more interviews available, but I always feel that authors have a hidden side to them, and which is largely true. I mean, there is something that they keep hidden away from the world. So, would you like to tell us something that we cannot find out about you from a simple Google search or from the blurb of your book? Something that just gives us an insight into who you are as an author.
Who I am as an author, I don't know. I'm thinking. Maybe could we circle back to this question perhaps at the end of the podcast? Uh,
Sure.
because
Sure,
I
but
can't. I mean, because I think I'm pretty public actually, so I don't know if there are hidden. And if there is something hidden, then there's probably a good reason why it's hidden. So, uh,
okay.
yeah, I'll think about this and we'll circle back to it. Yeah.
Sure. Let me make this a bit easier for you. It doesn't necessarily have to be something that defines you as an author, but just something that defines. I'll give you an example. A while back, I had Dr. Shiv Shankar Menon on the podcast. Right, he was a former national security advisor and the former foreign secretary. And one of the details he shared was that a lot of people don't know the fact that he was in a band with one of his friends. For Dr. S.Y. Qureshi was a former chief election commissioner, and they used to get together while they were working and jam out like a few songs. And he was a failed classical musician, but that did help him on his journey. So it was one of those things, right, that drove him. Like generally people don't imagine the national security advisor and chief election commissioner getting together to jam out a couple of songs, but that just added a huge new dimension to him as a writer. So yeah, we can obviously
Right.
circle back to this whenever you're comfortable talking about it. uh, but so Ananda, while I was reading your book, the first thing that crossed my mind was how, in fact, the first thing that crossed my mind was the fact that it seemed a lot similar, not in style, but in the terms of how it made me feel to Jhumpa Lahiri's work, right? There is an underlying melancholy in her work, which appeals to the reader, draws them into the book, which I kind of noticed in your writing as well. So, was this uh, was this something that particularly something that you had planned on? Was this something that uh, I know inspired you to write down, create this book in the first place, or was this just an organic result of your planning?
So Jhumpa Lahiri is definitely one of the authors that I like a lot. I would say she's one of my favorites, even though her body of work is quite lean. Since the time she's been writing, and of course, in recent times, she's writing in Italian, which I consider, I consider that to be kind of like Jhumpa Lahiri part two. So I'm not even
Yes.
counting her writing in Italian as her oeuvre, so to say.
Mhm.
But Siddharth, when I like a writer, I tend to go in depth rather than breadth. So even Akhil Sharma, who was actually kind enough to blurb my book, also he's written only two novels and one book of short stories, but he's written a lot of uh, nonfiction, like say personal essays for American magazines. He's written for the New Yorker, and I can safely say that I think I have read everything that say Akhil Sharma has ever written in his life. I have read every interview that he's ever given, and perhaps I think it would be the same for Jhumpa. So I think when you like an author very much, when they've touched you in certain ways, it's possible that certain styles or certain there could be certain resonances. I
Right.
do agree. I do feel that, say, the first chapter, which is this a woman in her 50s in New Jersey looking back at her life in North Calcutta. That chapter might have resonances of Lahiri. That's what, my editor and a couple of people felt as well. But I think after that, I don't think there's any Lahiri in my book after chapter one. But what I do like about Lahiri, I like the sense, and I think that is the factor of her right being such an expert short story writer, is that there's a sense of lingering. There's a sense of how the story kind of goes on. It never really finishes when the short story ends, and I think that is something uh, that is true for my book as well. I feel there's no clear conclusion. And for me, some of the best fiction, some of the best art that I have encountered is ambivalent. It's not neat, it's not neatly tied up with a bow. It takes you to one place and leaves you there. And so I would say these two things, maybe the tenor of the first chapter and the fact that the book doesn't have a neat ending, those are reminiscent of Jhumpa Lahiri, but not much else, because I also feel that, because I wrote this book over 5 plus 1 years, I wrote it over 5 years because I had full time jobs. And then 1 year I was editing. you also change as a person, as someone in my 30s, you also have life experiences and you change. So the book started out one way. Maybe it started out like Jhumpa Lahiri, very sweet and kind of mannered, but then it kind of went into this very different zone. So I don't think anyone reading the last chapter will ever say that it has any resonances with Lahiri, but the start of it does. I agree with you.
Right. And I think you make an excellent point about how some of the best art that you've encountered, and I concur with what you've just said, is stuff that's left ambivalent, right? I mean, I think that's the irony of what fiction works for, right? Fiction is something that is not real. That's something ideally, like the most basic sense of the definition is that it's something that is imaginary, something that's not real. And people turn to it to kind of discover themselves or discover worlds beyond their usual life. But the best kind of fiction is one which actually works like real life, when where you don't really have a definitive ending, right? Or you don't have definitive things to tie up your life with. It's not over until it's actually over. There's no happy ending or sad ending. There's just no ending till it's till death comes up. But so another something that and you mentioned that you wrote this book over 5 years and 5 plus 1 years, as you mentioned. But is there a particular event or like a particular memory that you have which sowed the roots of this seeds of the story or this entire book in your mind? Like where did it all begin? What kind of prompted you to pen down this story, or how did this world blossom in your head?
I do have a very specific answer to that, being a journalist, because these are questions I ask myself. So,
Hmm.
um, you know, now I've been a journalist, say, for 15 years, but 5 or 6 years ago, when the beginnings of this book kind of happened, and I would say happened because I don't think writing fiction, writing a novel, short story is a very conscious choice. In the sense, sure, you can decide I want to be a writer, but just by deciding that, the story is not going to um, come to you. I think it has to happen to you, like love. So as a journalist, I feel that I was a features writer. I was good at what I did. I was interested in writing, and I got approached by a couple of publishers to do non-fiction books, because around 5 to 6 years ago, also this idea of narrative long form, or literary nonfiction was becoming quite buzzy, and
Mhm.
publishers were looking for people, for feature writers, to do these kind of um, full length, journalistic explorations. So
Right.
I was approached by a couple of publishers, and I was wondering which one to go for. But they did not invigorate me. They were not making me very excited, because I realized, this is what I do Monday to Saturdays. I do journalism. And now, am I going to be just on Sundays or late nights, again, just going to be doing that in another form? So I was kind of dragging my feet on it. And then I was at the Mountain Echoes Literary Festival in 2015. I've been there, I think, once more or twice more after that, but this was the first time. And there was a session with the writer Janice Pariat, as in I was there to interview other people. I was there as a moderator, but she was speaking on stage, and I met her at that festival. And she said something really lovely. I think somebody was asking her about the process of writing, and she said that sometimes you know your end destination, and you're just driving on the dark road, but you know where you have to go. And sometimes you don't know where you're going. You can just see what the headlights reveal, and that's fine. And it was very inspiring to me. So when people ask why should they go to lit fests, or why should they talk to authors or listen to podcasts like this, I think it's because when you're on the fence, sometimes hearing something that another creator says or another writer says can be very inspiring. And I've told Janice this, and she's credited in my acknowledgements, but just the small thing she said was very inspiring to me, because I realized that as a journalist, I looked at the world a certain way, and I thought that I can't embark on fiction or embark on a book until I know exactly what it's going to be and how it's going to end, because that's how we do a journalistic story, right? You pitch to your
Right.
boss, and then you say, this is what it is. I'm going to speak to XYZ people. It's going to end like this. And I realized that writing fiction is what I've always wanted to do, and what I really want to do, but I'm afraid because, it really isn't a viable career, honestly. You can't not have a job and do it. I mean, it's not, it's honestly, it's not economically sustainable the way it is in India. There is no writing community as such. So it's not, you can't really kind of leave everything else and say, I'm going to be a writer. It would be a foolish thing to do. So I was afraid. But then I said, I mean, listening to her, I'm like, I don't need to know the end. I just need to know how I want to begin, and let's take a chance. I still have my job. I still have a life. I'm not giving up everything. So let's take a chance. And I did. And the first visual, I just had that first chapter. Actually, it's a woman who has suffered a huge loss, but and I didn't know what the loss was at the time, but just a woman who suffered a huge loss, and the world expects her to grieve in a certain way, but all she wants to do is have a cup of tea. And for me, the idea was also about fulfillment, and kind of the space that women occupy, because a cup of tea was not just, a hot beverage. It was everything that she wanted for herself. And so it was very poignant. And for 2 years, when I say I worked on the book for 5 years, for 2 years, I just worked on this first chapter. I held on to it. I just made revisions. I sent it to a few people who gave me edits. So for 2 years, I just had this first chapter, and it kind of grew from there. So that was the kind of kernel.
That's it took you, like, you hung on to the first chapter for 2 years is such a interesting thing to know, because to be very honest, I am an aspiring writer as well, and it's not that I write here and there, but not a lot. And just hearing this process is, and as you mentioned, right, this is exactly why you ought to attend literature festivals, or like read interviews, or particularly authors or any other artists for that matter, because it kind of inspires you to go down this road and have this journey of your own. But you mentioned that you've always sort of wanted to be a writer, and maybe like the economics of it didn't really appeal to you. But was it the only reason you did not write early on in your life? I mean, you mentioned you've been a journalist for 15 years and you just wrote the book over the last five. Or was there something in your 20s that stopped you from, uh, I don't know, approaching it, or did the idea not cross your mind? What was it?
Not really. So I've been writing kind of all through, because even as a journalist, I've been a feature writer, right? I haven't been
Yes.
a political reporter or a war correspondent. So I wrote as an editor for 3 years. I also wrote a personal column every week, which, parts of which have, kind of observations for which have even made their way into the book. So I feel writing is like exercising a muscle, and I have been writing throughout. As a kid, also, I wrote, poetry and short story, things that teenagers do. You write kind of soppy love songs. And so I've done all of that. I've gone through all the motions. But I was pretty, the kind of family I come from, the idea was that you graduate and you get a job and you pay rent and you get a master's degree, blah, blah. And that those are all steps towards becoming an adult. That's what I have seen. I mean, I'm happy for other people who have other kind of examples. Maybe they have writers or artists in their family, but I didn't. My parents are still working. So that's what I had seen, that people get a job and they work. And in my head, so that kind of conditioning is very strong. You can't fight that conditioning. So I did think that I needed, and I think even this whole idea of getting an MFA, I think it's kind of a little more recent for Indians to go abroad and get an MFA. So at the time that I was graduating from college, it wasn't really, it just wasn't somehow a talked about option that you can actually graduate and then go study creative writing. You kind of studied something that would get you a job. So again, I'm saying that these are limitations to the environment that I was exposed to. But when I became a journalist, then I loved what I did, and I was pretty career oriented. And when you're working 10 to 12 hours a day, when you're thinking that way, um, you're in a very, you're not in the kind of mindset or the psychological framework that is conducive to fiction. I think fiction requires a different pace. It requires you to look at the world with less judgment. It requires you to kind of, slow living, the buzzword that we use now. I think fiction needs you to look at the world in a certain way. And when you're a excitable 23-year-old, who wants to go like to 4 places to cover something every day, like I don't think you have that tehrav, like they say in Hindustani classical music, for fiction. So nothing came in the way. I just didn't have, I would say, the kind of, I was not in the psychological space. I was always a fangirl, and there were lots of writers. I mean, I read a lot, and I admired writers, but it was not something that I kind of was in the space to suddenly do. And after I achieved a certain kind of position in journalism, a certain way, I think I almost gave myself the permission that you are where you want to be in doing this journalistically. So maybe you can explore this, and maybe if you want to ever explore this is the time, because you can't keep telling yourself you're a writer and you want to be a writer and do nothing about it. So I finally took the plunge in 2015, but I do feel I had been writing in some way or the other. I also feel, Siddharth, that there are like writers, right, more so abroad, but even here, who publish their first book in their 50s or 60s. But I don't think that they become writers at 50s or 60s. I think if you're a writer all your life. That's who you are. That's your personality. You're the person who eavesdrops on conversations. You're the person who makes notes, who studies the ether, so to say. So you're always a writer, whether you are actually writing chapters or not. I think it's a personality trait, more than a skill.
That's such a beautiful takeaway to have. I mean, I think till this point of time, I had not given it that much thought that writing is a more of a personality trait rather than something that people did. Because I think a lot of people would agree with you when you say this, that just because you're writing your book at 30 or 40 or 50, whenever, it doesn't mean that you become a writer then, because you've been writing a lot of other things before that as well. But the bit about it being a personality trait, I think, is something that uh, would resonate with, I think, a lot of people who are listening to the podcast right now. Because a lot of them are readers, or some of them are aspiring writers, and often have these questions about themselves, right? And I think being able to notice that kind of gives them that confidence that there is something out there for them. But it's
Yeah.
excellent that you. Yeah, sorry, please go on.
Sorry, just one thing I want to add also is that, Siddharth, I think many people think or are told, you're a writer because they're good with language, because they're good in English, or because they
Mhm.
craft nice sentences. That's a start. But having written this book, firstly, I have tremendous respect for novelists, also novelists who write so prolifically. Say you mentioned Chitra Banerjee Divakaruni, someone like her who writes, a book every 2 years. Or I have tremendous respect for novelists, because I've also realized, and that's true for me. Maybe this is not something that other writers would agree with, but I realize that it's so little about the sentence level. It's so little about language. I mean, it's everything about language, but I'm saying, that's the last stage. It's so much more about plotting the book and planning and strategizing, and there's a lot of kind of mathematical intelligence that goes into planning a novel. You have to plot, you have to figure when these characters meet, who to bring in, how to turn. So the idea that because somebody writes cute sentences, or has a turn of phrase, that they would be novelists, is misguided. And I'm saying that is because that's what I thought writing entailed, right? As a teenager, I thought, oh wow, this person speaks so well, they must be a good writer. But it's not about language. It's also about the way you see the world, I think. And that's a realization that I had. So I just wanted to add that.
Right. And I just have this flurry of thoughts when you were talking particularly about this, because it's so strange how people evolve as readers and like as critics, right? I mean, something that you just said is one of the most like the biggest criticism academia faces, not just in India but across the globe. And I know it's not just fiction writing that I'm talking about here. That there is this I don't know, this trend or this phenomena where people are encouraged to kind of write complex sentences, or sentences with a flourish, which kind of emphasizes on their vocabulary or maybe their ability to play with words, but they actually end up not communicating as much to their readers, whether it's a non-fiction piece or a piece written in a journal or a short story. And some of the most prolific authors I've had the privilege of talking to or hearing from. Like, I mean, I just flashed back to this one time when I heard Lord Archer speak at one of his book release events, where he said, I think only someone who can write their entire book first down in 100 words is someone who can actually succeed as a writer. And in fact, in my previous episode of the this podcast, I was talking to Dr. Gyan Chaturvedi about this, and he mentioned something along the same lines, that the ability to communicate with your reader is something that should always take prime importance over, superfluous words or complex flourishes. And yeah, again, that's a great message to take forward for, budding authors and writers. Uh, but you did mention something that's actually something I'm going to harp on now. That you read a lot as growing up, which I believe a lot of authors and journalists, for that matter, are always engaging with. So, yeah, can you tell us a bit more about that? What were the kind of books that you read as a child? What was your introduction to the world of reading? Was it school, your mother, your father? Who was? How did you become a reader, and what did you read while growing up?
Right. So, coming from a Bengali family, and my mother studied comparative literature. So, she read a lot. We had a huge library. But if I had to credit, if I'm honest, and I feel these are questions also that I've thought about for when people have begun asking me this, right, for interviews around the book. I think it's the fact that I had an older brother. I think your siblings make a huge impact on you as a child. So my brother read a lot, and he was 4 years older to me. And when you're a devoted younger sister, what happens is that you want to do everything that your elder brother or elder sister is doing. So I was reading everything that my brother was reading, whether or not I was understanding it. But that meant that so when I was 10, I had my brother was 14, and he asked for the collected works of Anton Chekhov for his birthday, which I remember were 8 volumes. But I read all of it when I was 10 because it had come home and my brother was reading it. So I thought it was the coolest thing to do. And I remember he read Diary of Anne Frank for his 13th birthday. So I read it when I was 9. And those are not books. I don't think they were age appropriate, as in I was reading them much earlier. Of course, my parents didn't have an issue. So I think in my teens, my brother and what he was reading made a huge impact on me. Though what I've realized more recently also is that I read a disproportionate number of white male authors, because growing up that was considered literature, that was what was at home, right? So even a lot of Gabriel Garcia Marquez was at home. I read all his works in my teens. There was Julian Barnes a little later, but yeah, so I think I've been though quite a conventional reader. I wasn't reading sci-fi or thriller or mystery. I guess I was reading what is considered, what is now called literary fiction. In my 20s, I went into a huge, of course, Jhumpa Lahiri, also Amitav Ghosh, but I also went into a huge kind of Jonathan Franzen Bender. I'm a huge fan, and I feel one of the problems with cancel culture and this kind of wokeisms is that Jonathan Franzen is suffering because of it, because a whole group of people have just decided to hate him. So I'm really looking forward to his new book. Actually, I checked at a bookstore and they don't have the physical copies yet, so I'm waiting for Crossroads. But yeah, so in my 20s, then I went into a huge kind of Jonathan Franzen Bender, but also a lot of Toni Morrison and of course Adichie. In my more recently, I've been trying to read a little more varied works. So, a young colleague of mine introduced me to kind of feminist sci fi and feminist horror fiction recently. So, there's an American writer called Carmen Maria Machado who won the Folio Prize also recently. And she writes this kind of, it's actually, yeah, it's kind of feminist sci fi. So, it's kind of these dystopic, speculative scenarios, but with women at the center. And I've been reading this young Nigerian writer called Leslie Neka Arima, whose works are also available online. And a lot of young writers now, they write short pieces that are kind of digitally available. So, you don't even need to kind of wait for a complete collection. Also, when I was writing over the last 6 years, I had to be very protective about what I was reading, because when you're writing, your brain is very kind of fertile, so you end up getting influenced, or you can get swayed. So I was not reading any contemporary Indian writers at that time. So now that I'm done, over the last year, I've had a really good time catching up on all the books that I missed out on. So I read Latitudes of Longing by Shubhangi Swaroop, who is a friend and who also blurbed the book. And I truly think it's one of the best books to come out of India, in recent times. And I read Farfield also recently, which I loved. So yeah, so I think I'm trying to read more broadly and also more women. I love Rachel Kushner a lot. I love Mars Room, her last book, a lot. So yeah, I think, Siddharth, I've rambled on and on now about a number of names. So if you have any. Mhm.
No, it's lovely to see that you have such a wide breadth of readers, authors that you're reading, because that's something that I decided to a couple of years ago. Like you mentioned that while you realized quite early on, like towards your late teens, that you were reading a lot of white male authors, right? Which is generally considered to be literature, which is true, right? And that's why I kind of started pushing myself to read more varied things. So it's very interesting to know that you've been reading so many things, and I think I've learned of a couple of new authors from you, which I'm going to give a shot. We're unfortunately heading towards the end of the interview, but I have one question to wrap this up, and that also revolves around books. Um, if I ask you to name one book which has impacted you majorly in your life, right? Like, I mean, it's changed the way you kind of go about doing things in your life, or the way you perceive life, or life actions, or life interactions, which one would that be, and what was that change that inspired to you?
Uh, a book that has inspired me or inspired my writing?
Inspired you, like as a person, because I always believe that I mean, and I might be wrong here, that a book that has ended up inspiring you as a person, and not in terms of motivating you to do something, but just brought about to change in the way you're looking at the world or interacting with it, because it all inevitably would seep down into your writing as well.
It's a really hard, a tough question, to ask a writer to pick one book. But
Right.
I am going to actually pick a book that I feel also really inspired me as a writer, because I have been, that's been what I consider my primary identity for the last 6 years, and hopefully going forward. So I would say Akhil Sharma's Family Life, because I feel it made me look at the world differently. When I read that book, because I'll tell you specifically, because I told you I was a big Franzen fan, and I was interviewing him for Vogue at the Jaipur Lit Fest 6 years ago when he was there, just before I started writing, right? So 2014
Mhm.
specifically. And I asked Franzen, who's like everything, I've read everything by Franzen, and he said it was one of his best interviews. So then we were chatting, and I said, you're called the great American novelist. Who do you think is the great Indian novelist? And he said, of course, there are the usual names, Rushdie, Rohinton Mistry, uh, Jhumpa Lahiri, Arundhati Roy, Vikram Seth. He said all that. And then he's like, but there's this guy, Akhil Sharma, and I really like him. And I think he's the great Indian novelist. And honestly, I had not heard of Akhil Sharma in 2014. I doubt many people in India had, because his books were not out here. Like, he had published one book in the US. He's been based in the
Right.
US for a while. And there was a book called Family Life that was out in the US, but it was not out here. But
Right.
because Franzen, when an author you really like recommends a book, I just bought it. I think I bought it like at the festival bookstore, and I started reading it. And that book moved me so much, it affected me so much, and I was very confused by it. Firstly, it's a very sad book, but I was very confused by it because it was not like any of the books that I liked until then. It didn't have the beauty of Jhumpa Lahiri's writing. It didn't have the kind of historical depth of Amitav Ghosh. It didn't have the sentiment of Julian Barnes. It didn't have the kind of, the richness of Coetzee. So I was like, why do I like this book? It's a slim book, and I was puzzled by it. And then I met Akhil Sharma at the same festival the next year, and I read this New Yorker interview where he he said something, it was so beautiful, and I think it made me look at the world differently. Like I said, he said that he employed only two senses to write the book. A book, the way we are not always conscious, but we also read with all our five senses, and sometimes books are very slow reads because they get into a lot of depth of describing smells and food and touch, and they tangle you up. And he said in family life he wanted the reader to own the book and make it their own, so he only used the audio and the visual. And no one, I've never studied creative writing as such, no one's spoken to me about writing at that level. Just the idea of, then I reread the book and I realized it's true, the book only employs two senses. And it profoundly impacted me, because I realized that, as authors we are almost god. We can choose how readers respond to a book. We can choose whether readers salivate when they read a book. We can choose, we can turn on readers, we can make them crave memories, food, places, people. So that seemed like a big power, and I feel that made a very deep impression on me. So kind of the book, and I guess the talk, the story behind the book, and what Akhil said about writing of the book, all of that together made a very deep impression on who on me and my writing, because I tried to then employ very different sensorial worlds for Shashi and Tara, because I was writing about a mother and daughter, and I was really figuring, how do I make their chapters read differently, right? The alternate chapters in the Illuminated. And for a while I thought, should I use different vocabulary, because Shashi is in her 50s and Tara is in her 20s, so will their vocabulary be different? But I thought, like, that is so superficial. Let me use different sensorial worlds instead. So Shashi's world is, because you've read the book, you might, it might connect with you, but Shashi's world is more taste and smell, and Tara's world is more kind of visual and audio. So I tried to do that, and in the last chapter, when Shashi and Tara meet, all the senses are present, including touch. So I would say that, once you learn something like that, it's hard to unlearn it. So I think it really did profoundly impact me.
That's absolutely wonderful to hear. And like now when you mention it, it's something like, because now I'm thinking about the book and the kind of what I felt when reading those chapters, and it makes a lot more sense now. So it's, I think you're bang on, right? That when you learn something along these lines, you can't really unlearn this. But well, Ananta, before we wrap this up, I had asked you a question at the beginning of the interview. Do you want to take a shot at that, or should we take a pass on it?
No, yes, I would like, I won't like to take a shot, since you mentioned that one of your the one of the authors said they had a band. Well, I didn't have something as adventurous as having a band, but I was a pretty serious rock climber for a long time. Especially when I went to the US, I had a boyfriend who was a kind of professional rock climber. So we climbed some pretty serious peaks around Boston. When I moved back to Delhi as well, I was a member of the IMF, the Indian Mountaineering Federation, and we would kind of climb. And that's something that I've completely, after moving back to Bombay, kind of let go of. My harness lies unused. But I think that is a side of me that I have not spoken about. So I hope that is exciting enough for you. But
more
yeah.
than I think more than exciting, the reason why I asked this question to authors and why I kind of choose to keep asking it to all the authors who come here is because I think it tends to humanize authors a lot more. Kind of just gives them this personality, this side that as a reader, it kind of just makes the work seems more engaging when you know that the person behind the words is someone just as fallible as you, with their own, I don't know, imperfections and their own little things that they do in life which they may or may not continue doing, right? I mean, I think the fact that that fact that you're not still in touch with it, right, that you haven't been rock climbing ever since you were back in Bombay, is something that a lot of people relate to, right? Like this activity you once loved and now you just can't either find the time to do or just don't want to do, or whatever the other reason might be.
Correct. but actually I do feel I've tried to replace it with yoga, but I do feel that I do a kind of shoulder stand every day, and it's very important to me to write. I do feel as a writer, because you're so much in your head and you spend so much time by yourself and you're on your desk. I think having these kind of physical a kind of physical activity or a physical goal, whether that's yoga, walks, hiking, birding, or swimming, whatever it is, or climbing, is very good. Because for me, I've really, it helps you kind of get out of your head, which you need to, right? Otherwise you'll go crazy. So I feel even most writers I know, they're quite seriously engaged in at least one outdoor physical activity. And I think it's literally a breath of fresh air, and it helps with writing. I know one writer, I forgot who, but of popular books, who said he hangs himself upside down every 2 hours for a rush of blood to the head. So I think it's actually a physical need. You kind of need some kind of a physical activity that helps you get out of your head when you're writing for long stretches of time. So maybe I should look at getting back to rock climbing somewhere in Bombay.
You should. And I think with this answer, you kind of like really made the parents of younger or aspiring writers really happy, because I think this is one of the things that you like every parent tells a kid while growing up, listen, koi physical activity karo. So I think author says Ada, you've inspired a lot of parents with that answer. But yes,
Right. Mm.
I definitely agree. I think that is something that would end up helping authors. Thank you, Anandita, for doing this. This was absolutely lovely. I had a really good time talking to you, and you gave me a nice insight into what and how the book has come about, and it actually enriches my experience of reading your work. And I really look forward to reading more books by you. But I hope they don't take 5 more years to come out.
I
I'm
hope so
really
too.
excited.
I've quit full-time journalism, so I hope, and I've kind of started thinking and making notes for the next book, so I hope it's much sooner. But I want to thank you, Siddharth, because especially at a time like this, when authors are, like I said, cut off from their source of interaction, or say the nutrition that you get from meeting readers, these kind of virtual platforms are very welcome, because it helps you interact with readers. So thank you for making the time and effort to put this up and do this with writers. And all the best for your other sessions and for your own writing as well.
Thank you, Anandita. The pleasure's all mine. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, do subscribe to our podcast and like, share, and subscribe it. Check us out on Instagram, YouTube, and all other podcasting platforms. We do a lot of bookish stuff. And if you're a book fan or a bibliophile or a reader or whatever term you wish to call yourself by, you would definitely enjoy our work. Do check it out. Thank you.